Alright, and now we're in detailing part 1. And looks like I upresed her again for the Dynamesh purposes, but maybe not. So basically for detailing, what I'm going to start with here is I'm going to try and unsuccessfully a couple times to rebuild the inside of this thing because I want to replace every single one of these faces with a micro mesh. And ZBrush does a great micro mesh tutorial on ZBrush Central where he makes a ghillie mesh suit. So basically what you can do is you can take any surface, Z-remesh it, gives you nice even quads, and then what you can do is replace every face with a mesh that you want. And so what I'm going to do is replace this with just a bunch of holes. So I at first thought I needed specific hole or some specific mesh layout for these holes. I'm going to try and go in here and like Z-remesh it and all this stuff. And what I end up basically doing is just making a plane, making the holes the mesh that I want it to be, and then I just insert that in and then clip that out. So I'm going through all these trial and error things of what I think I need to do. But the problem is, I want the holes to be just perfect holes. I don't want them to be necessarily spaced around a certain mesh. So this technique wasn't working because it's giving me slightly larger holes, slightly smaller holes. I could have turned adaptive down on my Z-remesh and maybe that would have helped. But at the end of the day, this wasn't going to work. So what I basically did was just, here's my micro mesh. And again, ZBrush does this on ZBrush Central if you want to go through the steps. But just make my micro mesh, apply to a polyplane, and then slide that polyplane in there. I may try one more time. Oh, I'm just going to rebuild this ring. That's another bad thing. I mean, you don't have to go in there and rebuild a ring. You can just duplicate that cylinder, squash it down, enlarge it, and then you have a ring. I don't know why I decided I needed to go through this 10-step process. But again, like I said, you do it once, you learn a lot, and then you don't do it again. So, that's why. And watching this, this year-old video is a little bit embarrassing, but, here's a little transpose modeling, which there's a couple videos on ZBrush Central of me doing that. Or the SIGGRAPH video where I do the chord with the, I don't know, VGA port thing I did. So that's what I was talking about, where I just made a plane with perfect circles in it and just sliced it up and just put it in there. Good enough. Again, these are more techniques that I don't necessarily use again, but if you want to inset a thing, it's one way to do it. Give it an adaptive skin, thickness, and all that stuff. But there's better ways to go about doing those particular type shapes. And for here, if you want to bevel some edges, you can use Control Shift and just kind of bevel straight across that line. If you want to bevel, this is more of a complex shape, but if you want to align your object to the screen space, make it level, what you can do is drag a transpose line from one corner to the other corner and then hit that little white dot, and it'll actually flip that object so that transpose line is now straight across the screen. Then you can hold down Shift on any brush. You can hold down Shift with your trim dynamic and just across very long straight line, just right down. Now, of course, you can't use that on very complex curvy shapes, but it's useful for other situations. And here I'm doing a Dynamesh that's a little bit more complex. So I had a cylinder in there. Instead of just Dynameshing a cylinder out, I went ahead and made it a little bit more complex, and then I Dynameshed that out of the original helmet there. And another kind of cool thing about Dynamesh is you can create a very high-res complex Dynamesh with letters and lettering and stuff on it, and then you can what do they call it? They call it wow, I'm drawing a blank. Let me pull up ZBrush. This is embarrassing. You can do a Z plugin decimation. You can do a decimation master. So once you have a Dynamesh and it's super high res, you can decimate it down. Drops your file size. I mean, I have this whole helmet decimated down for rendering purposes at the high res to bake off of is like 90 meg. It's nothing. And the reason that is because I have, these super high res Dynameshes, but then I decimate it. And then if I want to go back in and add more detail, all I have to do is just, the Dynamesh settings are just saved in there. So all I can do is re-Dynamesh. I don't lose any quality. There might be some very small imperceptible quality issues a little bit, but at the end of the day, again, I would rather have that trade-off of speed than, maybe my quality is slightly being degraded on the micro level surface detail, so I'm going to spend another month box modeling every piece of this thing. It's like, no thanks. Number one, I'd go crazy, and number two, it's good enough. And again, this piece wasn't a be-all, end-all, super duper piece. It was more of a let's play around in ZBrush, let's concept in ZBrush, let's have fun in ZBrush, and let's bake something out so I can have stuff to play with. When I use all the cool new texturing programs, or all this cool new stuff that's out. And that's basically what this piece is for. It's just something for me to use with a bunch of different materials on it that I could practice with. This is a practice mesh. Practice concept mesh, practice modeling mesh, practice texture mesh, practice baking mesh, all that good stuff. So I learned a lot. And again, it's a year old, so techniques only get better and faster, and tools only get better and faster. And again, there's that complex nonsense shape and another one. And I guess they make sense in that they fit together. So that's something. At least I got that going for me, which is nice. But again, are they functional? Maybe not, I did set it up so if you do have her head in there and then you turn on transparency, you can pop these pieces off, and I was gonna do this, but I moved on to other things. But there's room for padding in there. There's room for hoses coming out of the back of these things. They could go up into her nose or down her esophagus. However she needs to function inside this mech helmet. To make her stay alive. It's all ready to be put in there. It's all her head has enough space, and it's in the correct position to actually go through and do all that if you wanted to. Here we're getting into some interesting things. So, this is where you start making a lot of insert mesh brushes and stuff. And another thing I end up doing here a lot is, and this is just something that I just did a lot on this thing. I don't know if I do it a lot anymore, but in this particular instance, on this particular helmet, what I would do is, so you mask out an area, give it a poly group, and you could do a polish by features, which I have on my my quick menu that I set up. And what you can do is, once you have that open border, you can go up to the curve brush, or I'm sorry, the stroke brush, or the stroke menu curve settings. There's 3 curve menus in there, and just choose one that has it's got like polygroup, border, polygroup and border, something like that. I just turn off everything except for border, and then I can frame that border with and if you watch the panel loop videos, I go into this too as well on pixelectric.com. You frame that border with a curve, and then any curve brush, you can just tap on that curve and adjust your brush size, and it'll just replace that curve with an actual mesh. And in this case, I used a lot on this thing was just like rubber insert filling on this whole thing. So by the end, again, like I mentioned before in the previous videos, every single thing needs to be a separate object. So all I have to do is do a color fill for a material ID, so I can take this into a texturing program and, use that, and you can get a really clean bake of what my materials are going to be. Here's insert brush. I got off ZBrush Central, I'm sure, a thread. Their insert mesh repository thread on ZBrush Central. And actually, if you want to play with this actual mesh and the textures I baked off of it, go to quixel.se. The Quixel Dedo Endo 3Do guys. They use my helmet for their the kind of I played around with it, and then I handed it off to them, and they went and took it and used it through their new Dedo program. So that's actually available for download. If you go to their website and go to their downloads, they have a couple different meshes you can download, and this is one of them. And it's got the mesh, it's got normal, ambient occlusion. I think they gave it a world space normal as well, so you can just plug all that into the new Dedo, and you can actually play around with this actual helmet game res. Now there's some bad geometry errors that were my fault when I baked out my normal. I use a program called HandPlane now, which is also awesome for cleaning up my bad decisions on my game reses, because I get lazy, I guess. By the time I'm done with this concepting and all the cool stuff, by the time I get to the real production-y stuff, I mean, I enjoy doing it, and it's relaxing to me to go through and game res and UV and bake stuff, but when I'm under a deadline, or I don't have enough time, or I'm having to fit that kind of stuff in between actual work, I tend to maybe get a little lazy. I'll be honest. So if you see any geometry errors, I'm well aware they're there on the normal shading. Okay, so on this thing, what I did was do a very quick ZBrush, reproject all, and then I got some UVs on this thing so I could take it into Noisemaker, and then I can have a surface. So I got that little hex pattern on there. So I don't actually end up baking that out, but you could use it for rendering or whatever you want. You could actually bake that into your mesh later on if you subdivide it a lot and export it out. Here I was practicing with like what would be interesting to kind of go through here. There's an edge loop function where you can extrude edges and kind of get some ribbing going on really quickly, and it didn't really work for me, so I just left it alone. But you can use Noisemaker to get those little hex patterns and give you a cool look like so. And then because it's just a surface, so it's just a map really at that point, you can just sculpt underneath it and it'll just update on the fly. It's not baked into the mesh at that point. Getting some details in here to hold some hoses. And on this thing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some rubber. Oh, maybe not yet, but that's another instance where I'm getting there. So I'm going to make some shapes here. This is going to be a new insert mesh. Let's go through here and insert some shapes. And again, these are all separate objects, separate subtools. And then by this time, I mean, this thing probably has 160 different subtools, but again, I'm not worried about organizing it. Everything's on the screen. All the subtools I need are on the screen. I don't need to worry about any of that stuff. So I use their military insert brush to get these hoses. And these are all, of course, set up so that they have creasing on them and they're built correctly so that when I Control D to subdivide, it gives me a nice hose shape. And again, I have the whole body still in there, but I go ahead and ditch the body just because, I had other obligations and I wasn't quite as fast back then as I was now. And this one, I just put a poly mesh back there and just draw a bunch of hoses on it. So this is like greeble detail underneath using their insert brushes. And then I'll just get rid of that polyplane, or maybe just leave it. But that'll kind of be some detail back behind, make it look really complex back there. And those are all separate objects too, so if I wanted to. Now, those are separate objects with different polygroups within a single subtool. So again, I don't have every single one of those wires as a separate subtool. I have them all as one polygroup, but they are still polygrouped in a way that I can access them individually to fill with color if I need to separately. Oh, here's where I go in. Oh wait, no. So I just put the plane in. I've already put the little mesh detail in there. So I'm doing the exact same. And these wires are probably a little small for actual baking resolution. I don't know. Maybe this helmet is 40 feet high. It's one of those super mechs. So yeah, probably poor choices for that much detail on wires for an object the size of a human head, but And this is the kind of stuff where it's like, well, should I rebuild the surface, or should I just do a quick mask and do a quick pause by features and Control Shift, pull that in and call it a day? At the end of the day, if it's a complex shape and it's all going to be one material, I mean, I don't know. I'll probably just leave it at that point. It's clean enough, and I can bake it out, and nobody's the wiser. Only I need to know that it's a sloppy sculpt. But again, you could certainly go through there and rebuild all that, or box model the hell out of it if you'd like. I was all about speed on this thing. I wanted to get this thing, all done in ZBrush, number one, and number two, I didn't want it to be a labor of love. I wanted it to be I still wanted to be just as excited to work on it on the last day of it as I did on the first day of it, and it actually happened, which is awesome. I started making some really weird, possibly bad design decisions around this area because I wasn't sure how I wanted to detail this. I didn't know if I wanted to go like sci-fi or military or alien or all above or none of the above. So I'm just kind of doing stuff, and it's not necessarily successful, and the details probably aren't to scale with the rest of it. I don't know. I'm not thrilled with how this area necessarily turned out, but it was fun. And again, I'm getting so caught up in little greebly areas here. And again, when I actually do my video where I slow down and I'll do this part of the video and then I'll go through and break it down each technique one by one. So as I do it, I'm talking, so you can follow along. I'll explain all this a lot better. And this is another thing too, where do I just use a lazy mouse to indicate a panel line? Is it two separate materials? If not, maybe I can get away with just lazy mousing it and smoothing it, or maybe damn standard. Maybe you can set up a RAM brush with certain settings that'll give you a nice clean panel lines and then call it a day. Or do I make it a Dynamesh and do I slice that and then fill whole auto groups, split them apart, regroup them, smooth them so I get a nice clean cut line? Or do I rebuild it and box model it, and smooth crease it, smooth it, sub Ds all over the place? Or all the above, none of the above? It's all case by case basis. And also for me specifically, a speed thing. Honestly, usually what ends up winning is whatever the heck is fastest. And even this late in the game, I'm in ultra detail mode, and I go ahead and just, this whole big shape back here isn't really working for me, so I want to have something like this kind of slides in there. So even this late in the game, I'm making fairly large design decisions on how these things are going to break apart and work. So break that apart, bevel those edges, pop some details in there, put some hinges in there. And this is another thing too. I really don't want, when I'm modeling and stuff, to sit there and think about how things are going to smooth if I pop some holes into a curved surface and it doesn't smooth right, or it boxes out. I don't want to deal with that. So that's why it's so exciting with using Dynamesh or Modo's Mesh Fusion. And there's even a plugin for Maya now with their new booleans where you can actually get real-time live sub D. You can make sub D stuff on the fly and have it work correctly and smooth correctly. And thank God, because I don't like using floaters. I like having the stuff in there, and if I want to put a bolt in there, I can. It gives me the freedom to do that. I don't have to sit there and fake it in Photoshop or fake it on my model. And it makes it a lot easier if I want to bake out certain maps, or if I want to Dynamesh this and rapid prototype it, make it into a 3D mesh or whatever. I don't have to sit there and try and convert a bunch of stuff because I faked all of it. It's all right there. It's all really easy. It's all really fast. I don't need to... I'm not sure what that part was. Oh, it's eyeball. No. So I make a little thing and then I try to use it, and I didn't like it. So go back here, make a plane, subdivide it up. Yes, make a custom insert mesh brush, and then I can use this around where I want to. So that's another really easy technique. We can go through that. The E3D, the Mike Jensen stuff, he goes through those processes very well. Definitely check those out. And those things right there, I slice the meshes up. And when you slice, it cuts the actual geometry, so you can have very, very smooth extrudes back when you're using Transpose. If I wanted to soften them out, I could have maybe done a very slight polish with those open edges and then masked them and pushed them back. Here I'm trying to get fancy, trying to find out if I can get some interesting shapes in here. And again, so if you have the lasso selection tool, what you can do, if you click on an edge, it'll actually select that poly loop or poly ring, however you want to look it up. And then you can do a edge loop. Edge loop with crisp on or edge loop with crisp off. It'll give you an edge loop if you have isolated mesh, and it'll pop those pieces out, and you can move them in and mask them and polygroup them or whatever you want to do. And you'll see me going through here just doing really quick passes. If you want to, you can duplicate a mesh off and really really have fun with it. And if you stumble upon something, you can keep it. If not, just like, you know what, get rid of that mesh. But just panel lines, standard brush, just kind of thinking how I want to divide this thing up. Slice, separate. That's a really easy way to kind of get some rubber ends on your pieces or some inset pieces. And those are just custom alphas that I can bring in. So that's Smart Transpose. So you can bring in a custom alpha with Smart Transpose and then get very precise placement, so you're not having to fight against drag rect or drag dot. Now the problem with this is because lettering isn't backwards and forwards, at least not the stuff I'm using, I have to turn off X and then do the alpha on one side and then go on the other side and do the alpha on the other, so it's correct, but oh biggie. More alphas, drag rect, alphas. And even going back at this point is like, well, I mean, I go very, very, very detailed on this thing, and I'm just, looking back, I probably could have not gone this second level of detail. The first level I think was just fine. This is more just how ridiculous should I get, can I get, or whatever. There's another example of me. I guess I lost that brush where I made that, so I just made it again. Little plastic inserts there. Again, this is like just the last little level of stuff. And I am getting kind of caught up in one area while I do this, but I guess at this level of detail it's not that terrible. And then I want to put a little ring around here so they can, reach up and just dial that off and on in there with a little rubber grip. So I go through a couple different variations of how I want to do that. And then what I end up with is this initialize. You can actually initialize by row and column. And then once you have that all set up, you can make those shapes and you can pop that center off. And then you got a little ring in there. If you go to ZBrush Central, search my last name, Pavlovich, and I think I go through some of these techniques on this actual helmet. So you'll actually see some breakdowns written down and with pictures and stuff where you can actually go through and slowly kind of do that. I totally forgot about that. Yeah, go to ZBrushCentral.com, look for Pavlovich, and you'll see this helmet thread, and you can go through and I point out a lot of these techniques that I use, and you can go through step by step. Inserting some rings. And that's the other cool thing and the freedom about Dynamesh is I can still experiment with anything. Like if I want to, I can duplicate, even if it's something clean and I like it, you know what, duplicate it off, and maybe I want to add something to it or subtract something from it or mask it and move it and whatever. I can do anything I want to. And I'm totally free to do that. I don't feel like I'm confined to, well, hold on, I got to figure out where my edges are, and do I need to collapse this to get it to smooth, or, I mean, do I, no, blah, yuck. Here I am using Shadowbox for some complex shapes, so I can make a shape like this, which would be pretty complex to model, but it's super simple just in Shadowbox, just to make the alphas in there, clean it up with Clip Brush, smooth it out. You can isolate the front and backs with polygroups, and you can just smooth that stuff out. You can have a cool little complex mechanical shape you can just drop in wherever, and you can make a whole library of that stuff. I don't know that I actually ended up using that, but that's how you do it. And you can actually borrow shapes from other places like I did there, and maybe put them somewhere else and Dynamesh that in. And so this is the point where you have a pretty decent library of stuff built up for the helmet, so you can just duplicate those things around, use insert brushes from the stuff you've already made, and because you're using your same library, it maintains your shape language throughout the entire piece. So that's kind of a cool side effect of also saving you work. It keeps it coherent, and you don't have to remodel everything. And of course, the cool thing about this is you can change what the wires are on the fly, and then once you like that, you can actually wrap more curves around it, or once you have a curve, you can snapshot that curve and duplicate it out and turn off bend. There's tons of curve functionality. I think on Pixel, I don't remember anymore. I've made videos about this for a couple different people and reasons, so maybe on Pixelogic I have a video on this, maybe I don't. I forget, but there's a lot of functionality in those curves.